Tonight's story begins with something simple. Something most people ignore. Observation. Not the kind where you glance at someone and move on, but the kind that lingers. The kind that notices what isn't being said. The kind that quietly asks, why does this person feel familiar, even when they shouldn't? Because sometimes, the most important people in our lives don't arrive as lovers. They arrive as strangers we can't quite stop watching. And sometimes, that's where everything begins. Have you ever noticed someone who didn't belong in your story, but somehow stayed in your thoughts longer than they should have? Not because they spoke to you, not because they tried to impress you, but because something about them felt unfinished, like a sentence you hadn't read yet, or a truth you weren't ready to hear. That's how it started for Naomi, not with love, not with longing, but with observation. It was a quiet Thursday evening in Manhattan, the kind where the city didn't feel loud, just distant. Naomi had chosen a corner table by the window, more out of habit than preference. She liked watching people pass by, without being part of their world. There was comfort in distance. There was safety in not being known. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts somewhere between work, memory, and the quiet kind of loneliness she had learned to live with, not fight. And that's when she saw him. Not dramatically, not like the world paused or music played. Just there, sitting alone 2 tables across from her. A man in a dark suit, slightly undone. Not careless, just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too long without putting it down. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't even pretending to be busy. He was just sitting, and somehow, that stood out more than anything else in the room. Naomi found herself watching him, not out of curiosity, but recognition. Not of who he was, but of how he felt. Because there's a certain stillness people carry when they've spent too much time being strong for everyone else. A stillness she knew too well. She looked away quickly, almost embarrassed by her own attention. But a few seconds later, her eyes drifted back again. He hadn't moved. That was what made it different. Most people shift, adjust, reach for something, anything to avoid sitting with themselves. But not him. He sat like a man who had already faced everything he was trying to avoid, and didn't know what to do next. Naomi felt something she hadn't expected. Not attraction, not interest, but understanding. And understanding is always more dangerous, because it asks nothing from you, yet somehow pulls you closer. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. She didn't know that the man sitting across from her was Elliot Carter, a man the world believed had everything. She only knew one thing. He looked like someone who had lost something he couldn't explain, and for reasons she didn't fully understand. She couldn't stop noticing him. A few minutes passed, then 10, then more. At some point, he reached for a glass of water, but paused halfway, his hand hovering as if he had forgotten what he was doing. That small moment told her more than words ever could. This wasn't distraction. This was someone who lived too much in his own thoughts. Someone who replayed things. Someone who carried conversations that had already ended. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. She knew that feeling too well. And suddenly, without warning, a thought crossed her mind. He reminds me of someone, not physically, not even in manner, but in presence, in the quiet weight he carried, without asking anyone to notice. It unsettled her, because the last person who made her feel that kind of recognition was a man she had spent years trying to forget. A man who had once loved her in the only way he knew how, by giving her everything. Except himself. She shook the thought away gently, almost instinctively. No, this man wasn't him. This was just a stranger. And strangers were safe. Strangers didn't come with history. They didn't reopen doors. They didn't ask questions you weren't ready to answer. But even as she told herself that, her eyes found him again. And this time, he was looking at her, not intensely, not boldly, just aware. Like he had noticed that she had been noticing him. For a brief moment, neither of them looked away, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not connection, not yet, but recognition, the kind that doesn't need explanation, the kind that simply says, I see you. Naomi was the first to break eye contact, not because she felt uncomfortable, but because she felt exposed, and exposure, she had learned, was where everything complicated begins. She reached for her bag, preparing to leave, telling herself this was nothing, just a moment, just a stranger, just a passing observation. But as she stood, she hesitated, just slightly, just enough to feel it. That quiet pull, that subtle question. What if this isn't random? She didn't answer it. She didn't need to, because some questions don't exist to be answered immediately. They exist to follow you, to stay with you, to unfold slowly over time. And as Naomi walked out of the cafe, she didn't look back. But she didn't forget him either. Because somewhere deep down, without knowing why, she felt it, that this stranger was not the beginning of something new, but the return of something unfinished. And sometimes, the most life-changing truths don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, in the form of someone you weren't looking for, someone you don't understand yet, someone who doesn't belong in your story, until they do. If that moment felt real to you, if you've ever recognized someone before knowing them, then stay with me, because what Naomi didn't know yet was that this stranger was a man she had already loved, and the truth he carried was about to change everything she thought she had healed from. The next time Naomi saw him, it wasn't planned, and somehow, that made it harder to ignore. 3 days had passed since the cafe. 3 quiet, ordinary days where nothing remarkable happened, except the fact that she kept thinking about a man she didn't know. Not obsessively, not in a way she would admit, but in small, inconvenient moments, while brushing her teeth, while answering emails, while staring out of her apartment window late at night, when the city slowed just enough for thoughts to become louder. It wasn't him exactly, it was the feeling he left behind, that quiet recognition, that unsettling sense that she had seen something real and walked away from it too quickly. Naomi didn't like unfinished things, which was ironic. Considering how her marriage had ended, she pushed the thought aside as she stepped out of her building that morning, adjusting the strap of her bag. The air was crisp, the kind that made the city feel sharper, more awake. She had a meeting across town, important but not important enough to distract her completely, because even as she walked, part of her mind remained somewhere else. Somewhere. Unresolved. She didn't expect to see him again. New York didn't work like that. People crossed paths once and disappeared. That was the unspoken rule. Moments happened, and then they ended. But life had a quiet way of breaking its own rules, when it wanted to. She noticed him before she realized she had a familiar stillness, a presence that didn't rush, didn't compete with the movement around it. He stood near the edge of the sidewalk, waiting to cross, hands in his coat pockets, gaze distant, not distracted, just elsewhere. Naomi slowed, not intentionally, just enough to confirm what her instincts had already told her. It was him, the stranger. For a brief second, she considered walking past him, pretending she hadn't noticed, letting the moment stay exactly what it was meant to be. Temporary, safe, uncomplicated. But then he turned slightly, and their eyes met again. This time, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't fleeting. It was recognition. Clear, certain, undeniable. And something in Naomi shifted before she could stop it. Because now, he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had seen her before. And that made walking away feel different. Harder, more intentional. She hesitated for half a second. Then, against her usual instincts, she stepped closer. "Hi," she said. Simple, neutral, safe. The kind of word that didn't promise anything, but still opened a door. He looked at her, and for a moment, there was something like surprise in his expression. Not dramatic, just subtle, as if he hadn't expected her to be the one to speak first. "Hi," he replied. His voice matched his presence. Calm, measured, a little distant, but not cold. They stood there for a second longer than necessary, 2 people with no reason to talk. And yet, neither of them moved. "I think we saw each other a few days ago," Naomi added, giving him an easy way to respond, or not. He nodded slightly. "We did. That was quiet," she said, almost smiling. He glanced down briefly, then back at her. "I think that's why you noticed." She let out a soft breath that almost turned into a laugh. "Maybe." A pause followed, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt observational, like both of them were trying to understand something without asking directly. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys being watched." "I don't," he said honestly. "Then why didn't you leave?" That question lingered between them, not heavy, but not light either. He considered it for a moment. "Because you weren't watching me the way most people do." Naomi's brows drew together slightly. "And how was I watching you?" He held her gaze, not intensely but carefully, like you understood something you shouldn't have. That landed deeper than she expected, not because it was wrong, but because it was accurate. She looked away briefly, gathering herself. "That sounds like projection," she said, though her voice had softened. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe it's recognition." That word again. Recognition. Naomi exhaled slowly, her guard shifting. Not down, but adjusting. "You say that like you believe it." "I say it like I've felt it before." Something in his tone made that sentence linger. Not the words, but the weight behind them. Naomi studied him more carefully now. Not just observing, but paying attention. "You always talk like that?" she asked quietly. "Like what?" "Like you're choosing your words carefully, so you don't say too much." touched his lips. Only when it matters. And does this matter? She asked. Another pause, but this one felt different, more personal. He didn't answer right away, and for some reason, she didn't rush him. More than it should, he said finally. Naomi felt that. She didn't know why, but she did. The crosswalk signal changed, people moving around them, brushing past as if the world hadn't slowed down at all. But for a moment, it felt like it had. "You're not going to ask my name?" she said lightly. "I was waiting to see if you wanted to tell me." She smiled, just slightly. Naomi. He nodded once. Elliot. The name settled between them. Not unfamiliar, but not fully placed yet. Naomi repeated it quietly in her mind. Elliot. Something about it felt close, but she couldn't quite reach it. "Nice to meet you, Elliot," she said. There was a small pause before he responded. "You too." But something in his tone suggested that wasn't entirely true. Not because he disagreed, but because it didn't feel like meeting. It felt like remembering something he hadn't fully recognized yet. Naomi noticed it, and for a brief moment, so did he. They stood there as the crowd moved around them again, the city reclaiming its rhythm. This was the part where one of them should leave, where the moment should end naturally. But neither of them moved. "Do you always stop and talk to strangers?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "Then why now?" Naomi considered the question, not superficially, but carefully. "Because something about you felt unfinished." The word hung between them, and this time, Elliot didn't hide his reaction. It was subtle, but real. "Unfinished," he repeated. She nodded slightly, like a thought that didn't get completed. Elliot looked at her differently then, not as a stranger, not even as someone new, but as someone who had stepped into a space he thought only one person had ever occupied, and that realization unsettled him more than he expected. "Maybe it's not unfinished," he said slowly. "Maybe it just hasn't been understood yet." Naomi felt a quiet shift in her chest, because that sentence wasn't just about him, and they both knew it. A car honked in the distance. Someone brushed past her shoulder. The moment stretched, but reality pressed back in. Naomi glanced at her watch. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move immediately. Elliot nodded. "You should," but his tone didn't push her away. It acknowledged something neither of them had defined yet. Naomi hesitated for just a second, then, "Maybe I'll see you again." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a certainty either. Elliot held her gaze. "Maybe you will." She nodded once, then turned, and this time, she walked away. But something had changed, because now, he wasn't just a stranger she had noticed. He was someone she had spoken to, someone who had seen her clearly enough to respond honestly. And that made everything more complicated. Behind her, Elliot didn't move immediately. He watched her disappear into the crowd, his expression unreadable but not unaffected, because for the first time in a long time, something had interrupted his carefully controlled world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way truth often does. And as he finally turned to leave, there was only one thought he couldn't ignore. Why does she feel familiar? In a way that shouldn't be possible. He didn't have the answer, not yet. But he would, because some connections don't begin when people meet. They begin when something unfinished decides it's time to be understood. And whether they were ready or not, that understanding was coming. The third time they met, it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like something returning. Naomi didn't say that out loud, of course. She wasn't the kind of person who rushed meaning into moments. Life had taught her that not everything needed to be labeled immediately, but there was a difference between not labeling something and not feeling it at all. And she felt this. It had been a week since their brief conversation on the street. A week of normal routines layered over quiet interruptions, memories of his voice, the way he paused before answering, the strange familiarity that didn't make sense. She told herself it would fade. Things like that always did, but they hadn't. Instead, it had settled into something quieter, something steadier, which is why, when she walked into the bookstore that Saturday afternoon and saw him standing near the back shelf, she didn't feel surprised. She felt confirmed. Elliot stood with a book in his hand, though he didn't seem to be reading it. His attention was somewhere else. Again, that same distant focus, like his mind existed slightly ahead of the present moment. Naomi watched him for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation this time, but awareness, because now, she understood something she hadn't admitted before. This wasn't random. And that realization came with a quiet responsibility, because when something keeps returning, it usually wants something from you. She stepped closer, not carefully, not cautiously, just honestly. "You don't seem like someone who reads fiction," she said, her voice soft but steady. Elliot looked up, and this time, the recognition in his expression came instantly. No delay, no question. You don't seem like someone who makes assumptions, he replied. Naomi's lips curved slightly. I don't. That's why I said, seem. He nodded, closing the book without marking the page. I don't read it often, he admitted. Why not? He considered that for a moment, like it wasn't a question he'd answered before. Because fiction requires you to feel something without controlling the outcome. Naomi studied him more closely. And that's uncomfortable for you. It used to be, he said. Used to. Elliot hesitated. Then, simply, I'm learning. That word stayed with her. Learning. It suggested effort, change, something unfinished. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, leaning against the edge of the shelf. That's interesting, she said. Most people don't say they're learning unless something forced them to. Elliot met her gaze. Something did. There was no drama in his voice. No attempt to make the statement heavier than it already was, which made it heavier. Naomi didn't push immediately. She had learned that people who speak carefully usually carry things that shouldn't be rushed. Instead, she shifted slightly. So, what are you trying to learn? She asked. Elliot looked down at the book in his hand, turning it over once before answering. How to stay, he said quietly. Naomi felt that before she understood it. How to stay. She repeated. He nodded. Not physically. I've always been good at that. A brief pause. But mentally, emotionally, I was never really there. The honesty in that statement caught her off guard. Not because it was shocking, but because it was clear. Most people didn't speak like that. Most people softened the truth. Elliot didn't. And now? She asked. Now I'm realizing that being present isn't automatic, he said. It's something you choose, over and over again. Naomi looked away briefly, letting that settle. Because that wasn't just his truth. It was hers, too. I used to think presence was something people just gave naturally, she admitted. Elliot's gaze sharpened slightly. And now? Now I think it's something people avoid, when they don't know how to deal with what they feel. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was no distance in it. Just recognition. Clearer than before. Stronger, more difficult to ignore. Elliot shifted slightly, setting the book back on the shelf. What made you realize that? He asked. Naomi hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer carried a name she hadn't spoken in a long time. A relationship, she said finally. Elliot didn't react immediately, but something in his posture changed, subtly, like a quiet tension he didn't fully understand. Did it end badly? He asked. Naomi shook her head. No, she said softly. That's the strange part. He waited, and she continued. It didn't end with betrayal, or anger, or anything dramatic. A small pause. It ended with absence. Elliot's expression shifted slightly, not visibly to most people, but Naomi saw it, because she knew what that word meant. It's harder to fight absence, she added. There's nothing to hold on to, nothing to argue against, just space. Elliot looked at her like he understood that more than he should. Yeah, he said quietly. There is. The air between them felt different now, less like two strangers talking, more like two people slowly uncovering something they didn't expect to share. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You talk like someone who's been on both sides of that. Elliot didn't deny it. I have. Which one were you? She asked gently. The one who left, or the one who stayed and felt it disappear? A long pause followed. This one, heavier, more deliberate. Elliot didn't look away. I was the one who stayed, physically, he said, and left in every other way. The honesty of that answer didn't just land, it stayed. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest, not because she judged him, but because she recognized the truth in it. That's a difficult thing to admit, she said. It's a necessary thing to understand, he replied. Their conversation wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it was real. And real conversations have weight, even in silence. Naomi shifted slightly, her voice softer now. Do you think you can change that? Elliot didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't a question about possibility. It was a question about effort. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know I have to try. Naomi nodded slowly, because that, more than certainty, was what mattered. Effort, awareness, choice. She looked around the bookstore briefly, then back at him. It's strange, she said. What is? I don't know you, she admitted, but it doesn't feel like I'm talking to someone new. Elliot held her gaze. It doesn't feel new to me either. There it was again. That quiet, unsettling truth. Not forced, not explained, just present. Naomi exhaled softly. Maybe that's what unfinished things feel like, she said. Elliot's eyes didn't leave hers. Or maybe it's what truth feels like, before we understand it. A small silence followed, but this one didn't feel uncertain. It felt inevitable. Naomi glanced toward the front of the store. I should probably stop running into you accidentally, she said, though there was no urgency in her tone. Elliot's expression softened slightly. You think this is accidental? She met his gaze again. No, she said quietly. I don't. Another pause. But now, it carried something new. Awareness. Then what do you think it is? He asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. Not lightly, not defensively, but honestly. I think, she began, then stopped briefly, choosing her words. I think some people come back into your life before you realize they never fully left. Elliot didn't move, didn't respond immediately, but something in his expression changed. Not confusion, not recognition fully, but something close enough to feel, close enough to matter. Naomi picked up a book absent-mindedly, flipping it open without reading. And I think, she continued softly, those are the people who usually teach you something you didn't learn the first time. Elliot's voice, when he spoke, was quieter than before. What do you think we're supposed to learn? Naomi closed the book gently, then looked at him, not as a stranger, not even as someone new, but as someone standing at the edge of something deeper. Maybe, she said, how to be honest, before it's too late. The words settled between them, not heavy, but meaningful, and for the first time, Elliot didn't try to analyze what he felt. He just felt it, which for him was new. Naomi stepped back slightly. I should go, she said again, but this time, she meant it. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she understood something important. Some moments need space to grow. Rushing them breaks them. Elliot nodded. Yeah, but neither of them moved immediately, because leaving now didn't feel like ending something. It felt like continuing it, just in a different direction. Naomi gave him a small, almost unnoticeable smile. Try the book, she said, gesturing toward the shelf. You might learn something you're not expecting. Elliot glanced at it briefly, then back at her. I already am. Their eyes held for one last second. Then, Naomi turned and walked away. And this time, Elliot didn't watch her out of curiosity. He watched her with something closer to understanding, because for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was standing in front of something real, not controlled, not predictable, but real. And as he reached for the book again, one thought stayed with him. Not loud, not urgent, but clear. What if this isn't about meeting someone new? What if this is about becoming someone different? He didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. If this chapter made you pause, if you've ever recognized something real in someone before you could explain it, then this story is already speaking to you. Take a moment to like this video, because it helps stories like this reach people who need them. And in the comments, tell me honestly, have you ever met someone who felt familiar before you even knew them? Don't forget to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because what Naomi and Elliot are about to uncover is deeper than coincidence. It's about truth, timing, and the kind of love that doesn't disappear. Even when people do, stay with me. Because the past they haven't spoken about yet is where everything begins. The past didn't return all at once. It never does. It arrives in fragments, quiet, almost uninvited, slipping into the present through the smallest openings. A word, a tone, a pause that lasts just a second too long. For Elliot, it began later that night. He sat in his penthouse. The city stretched beneath him like something he had built, but never quite belonged to. The lights flickered endlessly, each one representing a life, a story, a moment. And yet, none of them reached him where he sat. He had grown used to that distance. At first, he thought it was the cost of success. Then, over time, he realized it was something else. It was the cost of control. Elliot had always believed that if he could control everything, his work, his time, his outcomes, then nothing could break, nothing could fall apart. But control had a quiet side effect. It made you step back from everything that couldn't be predicted. And love. Love was never predictable. He exhaled slowly, loosening his tie, though there was no one there to notice. The silence in the room wasn't new, but tonight it felt different, heavier, not because of the space, but because of what filled it. Her words. It ended with absence. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze unfocused. Absence. That word had followed him before, long before Naomi said it in the bookstore. He just hadn't listened to it then. But now it refused to stay quiet. And without warning, his mind pulled him back. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just naturally, to a version of himself he hadn't fully faced in years. There was a time when Elliot didn't sit in silence. There was a time when silence didn't exist between them at all. Naomi used to fill it, not with noise, but with presence. It had started simply, like most real things do. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A connection that didn't need effort. A kind of ease that felt rare, but not fragile. She didn't try to impress him. and he didn't try to control the moment. That was what made it different. She asked questions, not the surface kind, but the kind that made him pause, the kind that made him think, the kind that made him feel seen. At the time, Elliot thought that feeling came from her. He didn't realize. It came from who he allowed himself to be around her. He could still remember one of their early evenings. They had been sitting on the floor of an apartment that wasn't finished yet. No furniture, no decorations, just two people surrounded by possibilities. Naomi had been talking about something simple, something small, and he had been listening. Not halfway, not distracted, fully, and at some point she had stopped speaking and just looked at him. What? He had asked. She smiled softly. You're actually here. Elliot had frowned slightly. Of course I am. But she shook her head gently. No, she said. Most people are physically present, but mentally somewhere else. He had dismissed it then, not because he disagreed, but because he didn't understand. You think too much, he had told her. And you don't feel enough, she had replied. It hadn't been an argument, just an observation, one he didn't take seriously, at least, not then. Elliot stood now, walking slowly toward the window, the memory settling into something heavier, because that moment, that simple exchange, had been a warning, and he hadn't recognized it. Back then, everything felt stable, predictable, safe. He built his business with precision. He built their life with intention. He made sure they never lacked anything. But somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing what couldn't be measured. Naomi didn't ask for more things. She asked for more presence. And that was something Elliot didn't know how to give consistently. At first, it was small, missed conversations, delayed responses, moments where he said, later, without realizing how often later never came. He convinced himself it was temporary, that once things settled, he would return to who he had been. But life didn't pause for that, and neither did distance, because distance doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly, until one day, you're sitting next to someone you love, and realizing you haven't truly felt them in a long time. Naomi noticed it before he did. Of course she did. She always paid attention to the things he overlooked. Are you okay? She had asked one night. Elliot barely looked up from his laptop. Yeah. Why? She hesitated. Because you're here. But not really. He sighed lightly. Not irritated, but distracted. I'm just busy, Naomi. That's all. She nodded slowly. I know, she said. But busy doesn't have to mean absent. That word again. Absent. It had been there from the beginning. He just didn't understand its weight. I'm doing this for us, he told her. I know you are, she said gently. And then, after a small pause, but I don't need everything you're building, Elliot. If I don't have you in it, that should have stopped him. It should have made him pause, re-evaluate, change something. But instead, he reassured her, promised her, told her it would get better. And then, he went back to work. Because in his mind, love was something you secured through effort, through provision, through stability. He didn't realize. Love also needed attention, presence, choice. And those were things no amount of success could replace. Elliot closed his eyes briefly, the memory settling deeper now. Because the truth wasn't that he didn't love her. It was that he loved her in a way that made sense to him, not in the way she needed. And that difference was everything. He opened his eyes again, the city still glowing beneath him, unchanged, unaware, unaffected. But he wasn't. Because for the first time, he wasn't just remembering the past. He was understanding it. And understanding comes with something difficult. Responsibility. He ran a hand through his hair slowly, his thoughts returning to the present, to the bookstore, to Naomi, to the way she had said, it ended with absence. Only now. He knew exactly what she meant, because he had been the one who created it. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. And sometimes, that's what hurts the most. The quiet ways we lose people. The ways that don't feel like mistakes until it's too late to correct them. Elliot exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, even though no one was there to hear it. I didn't know. The words felt incomplete. Because knowing wasn't enough anymore. Understanding wasn't enough. What mattered now was what he chose to do with it. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He wasn't trying to fix everything immediately. He was just sitting with it. The truth, uncomfortable, unfinished, but real. And somewhere, in that quiet moment, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before. This wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about regret. It was about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been given another chance to understand something he had once misunderstood. Not to rewrite what happened, but to approach it differently, to be different. And as that thought settled in, It didn't feel like relief. It felt like responsibility, the kind that doesn't come with guarantees, only choices. And outside, the city kept moving, unaware that inside a quiet penthouse, a man who had spent years building everything was finally beginning to understand what he had failed to hold on to, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. And now, he was learning, just like he said. The only question left was, would that be enough? Or had the lesson come too late? Naomi didn't remember the exact day she started feeling alone in her marriage. That was the hardest part. There wasn't a moment she could point to, no argument that clearly broke something, no betrayal she could name and say, that's where everything changed. It would have been easier if there had been, easier to explain, easier to justify, easier to walk away. But what she experienced didn't come with a clear beginning. It came quietly, gradually, like something fading instead of breaking. And fading is harder to fight, because you don't always notice it happening. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, though she hadn't taken a sip in minutes. The apartment was warm, softly lit, peaceful in a way that most people would have envied. But peace and emptiness can look the same, until you feel them. Naomi leaned back slightly, her eyes drifting toward the window. The city stretched out before her, alive, moving, filled with stories that had nothing to do with her. And for a moment, she wondered when she had started feeling like an observer in her own life. It hadn't always been like that. There was a time when everything between her and Elliot felt alive, not perfect, but real. He used to listen, not just to her words, but to her pauses, her tone, the things she didn't fully know how to say. That was what made her fall in love with him. Not his ambition, not his success, but his attention, the way he made her feel like she mattered, without having to ask for it. And that's why it took her so long to understand what was happening later. Because when someone gives you that kind of presence at the beginning, you don't expect it to slowly disappear. She remembered one evening clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. And sometimes, ordinary moments reveal the most. She had been sitting on the couch, talking about her day, something small, something unimportant. Elliot was beside her, his laptop open, his focus divided. At first, she didn't think much of it. He was building something. She respected that. She supported that. She believed in him. So she kept talking. But somewhere in the middle of her sentence, she stopped. Not intentionally, just naturally, because she realized something. He hadn't reacted. Not to her words. Not to her pause. Not to her silence. And silence used to be something he noticed immediately. She looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, she saw it clearly. He was there, but he wasn't with her. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't intentional. It was just real. Elliot? She said softly. He glanced up quickly. Yeah? She hesitated, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she didn't know how to say it without making it sound bigger than it felt. And yet, it was bigger than it seemed. Do you ever feel like you're somewhere else, even when you're here? She asked. He frowned slightly, not understanding the weight behind the question. I'm just working, Naomi. She nodded slowly. I know. And that was the problem. She always knew. She always understood. She always adjusted. Until one day, she realized she had adjusted so much. She no longer felt like herself. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, the memory settling into her chest like something she had carried for too long. Because the truth was, she didn't leave Elliot because she stopped loving him. She left because she didn't feel loved in a way she could live with. And those are two very different things. People think love ends when relationships end, but sometimes love is still there. It's just not enough. She stood from the table, walking slowly toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass. You were trying, she whispered softly, as if speaking to a version of him that only existed in memory. And I saw that. That was what made it so complicated. Elliot wasn't careless. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't someone who didn't care. He cared. In the way he understood. He provided. He protected. He built. But he didn't realize that love wasn't just about what you give. It was about how you show up. And showing up required something he didn't yet know how to sustain. Presence. Naomi rested her forehead lightly against the glass, her voice quieter now. I needed you. Not just your effort. The words weren't bitter. They weren't angry. They were clear, and clarity often comes after distance. Because when you're inside something, it's harder to see, but once you step away, everything becomes sharper, more defined, more honest. The night she left hadn't been loud. There were no raised voices, no accusations thrown across the room, just two people sitting across from each other, both aware that something had changed. Not suddenly, but finally. I don't think you see me anymore, Naomi had said. Elliot looked at her, confused. What do you mean? I'm right here. She shook her head gently. That's the problem. He didn't understand, not fully, and she could see it in his eyes. Not denial, just distance. The same distance she had been feeling for months. I know you love me, she continued softly, and I know you're trying. Elliot nodded quickly. Then why does this feel like you're leaving? Naomi's breath caught slightly, because that was the part that hurt the most. I'm not leaving because you don't love me, she said. I'm leaving because I don't feel it. In the way I need to. The room had gone quiet, not tense, not angry, just honest. And honesty doesn't always fix things. Sometimes it just reveals them. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. Then tell me what you need. Naomi's eyes softened, because she had already tried, not once, not twice, but many times, in different ways, with different words, hoping something would finally connect. I needed you to notice, she said gently. To be there without me asking. To choose me, even when everything else felt more important. Elliot swallowed, the weight of her words settling in slowly. I thought I was doing that. I know, she whispered. And that was the truth that made everything so difficult. Because he believed he was, and she believed he wasn't, and both of them were right. In their own way. Naomi opened her eyes again, the memory fading back into the present. Her apartment felt quiet again, but not empty, not the same way it had before, because, now, there was something else there. Understanding, not just of him, but of herself. She had learned something important when she walked away, something she hadn't fully understood while she was still inside the relationship. Love is not just about staying, it's about how you stay, and staying without presence. Feels like being alone next to someone. She stepped back from the window, exhaling slowly. Her thoughts drifted back to the bookstore, to Elliot, to the way he had said, I'm learning. That word carried more weight now, because she knew exactly what he meant, and she knew exactly what it would cost. Change wasn't about realizing something once, it was about choosing differently, repeatedly, and that kind of change was difficult, uncomfortable, slow, but possible. The question was he really ready for it? And more importantly, was she? Naomi walked back toward the table, picking up her cup of tea and taking a small sip. It had gone cold, but she didn't mind, because some things don't need to be perfect to be real, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to sit with a thought she hadn't fully embraced before, not hope, not expectation, just possibility, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that simply waits to see what you choose to do next, and somewhere, in the space between what had been and what could be. Naomi understood something clearly. This wasn't about going back. It wasn't about repeating the past. It was about whether two people, who had once misunderstood love, could learn it again, the right way, this time, and that kind of answer could only come from one thing, not words, not memories, but choices, the kind you make when it matters most. By the time Naomi saw Elliot again, the city had already started telling a different story about him, and, like most stories people tell from the outside, it sounded complete, convincing, almost believable. But something about it didn't sit right with her, not because she knew the truth, but because she understood him just enough to know when something didn't align. It started small, a passing comment at work, a quiet mention during a meeting, a name said casually, followed by a look that carried more implication than explanation. She's been seen with him more than once. He bought her something. Expensive. Not just expensive. Personal. Naomi didn't ask questions at first. She didn't need to. People were always willing to fill in the gaps themselves. That's what made rumors so powerful. They didn't need proof. They just needed enough detail to feel real, and the rest, people would create on their own. She sat across from her colleague, barely touching her lunch, her thoughts somewhere else entirely. You're awfully quiet today, he said. Naomi forced a small smile. Just thinking. About Elliot Carter? He asked casually. Her eyes lifted, not startled, but aware. Why would you assume that? He shrugged lightly. Everyone's talking about him. That's not new, she replied. No, he agreed. But this is different. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer. How? He leaned back slightly, lowering his voice. Not because it was necessary, but because it made the conversation feel more important. They say he's involved with someone. Naomi didn't react immediately, not outwardly, but something inside her shifted. Not jealousy, not anger, just attention. And, she asked calmly, and they say he bought her a house. That made her pause. Just briefly, but long enough to matter. A house? She repeated. Yeah, he said. Not just any house either. Something significant. Naomi looked down at her plate, her mind moving faster than her expression showed. Because something about that didn't make sense. Not completely, not clearly, but enough to feel off. And you believe that? She asked. He shrugged again. It's Elliot. It wouldn't exactly be surprising. Naomi nodded slowly, outwardly agreeing, inwardly questioning, because while Elliot was capable of grand gestures, he wasn't careless with meaning. And a house. A house wasn't just a gesture. It was intention. Later that evening, Naomi found herself walking without a clear destination. Not aimless. Just thoughtful. The city moved around her as it always did, fast, indifferent, alive. But she felt slightly outside of it, like her thoughts had created a quiet distance between her and everything else. She replayed the conversation in her mind, not the words themselves, but the feeling behind them. Something wasn't aligning, and Naomi had learned over time to trust that instinct. Because misalignment doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something is hidden. She didn't expect to find him, not consciously, but something in her steps slowed as she approached the same street where they had spoken before. And there he was, standing near the corner again, not waiting for anyone, not checking his phone, just present. In that same quiet way that had caught her attention the first time, Naomi stopped a few feet away, not approaching immediately, just observing, because this time, she wasn't just noticing him, she was trying to understand him, and understanding requires patience. After a moment, Elliot turned slightly, and just like before, he knew she was there. You have a habit of finding me, he said. Naomi stepped closer, her expression calm but thoughtful. Or maybe you have a habit of being in the same places I am. A faint hint of amusement touched his face. Maybe. She studied him for a second, more carefully this time. Can I ask you something? She said. Elliot nodded. You usually do. Naomi took a small breath, not nervous, but intentional. There's a story going around about you. Elliot didn't react, not immediately. But something in his stillness shifted. I'm aware, he said. That doesn't bother you? She asked. It depends on the story. Naomi held his gaze. They say you bought a house. For someone. Elliot looked at her, really looked at her, and, for the first time, there was something heavier in his expression. Not guilt, not defensiveness, just wait. And what do you think? He asked. Naomi didn't answer right away, because this wasn't about what she thought. It was about what she felt, and those two things weren't always the same. I think, she began slowly, that people believe what makes sense to them. And does it make sense to you? He asked. She shook her head. No. That answer surprised him. Not because it was bold, but because it was certain. Why not? He asked. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, her voice steady. Because a house isn't just something you give casually, she said. It means something. Elliot's eyes didn't leave hers. And, what do you think it means? Naomi hesitated. Then, it means intention. A quiet silence followed, not empty, but charged, because she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. Elliot exhaled slowly, looking away briefly before returning his gaze to her. It does, he admitted. Naomi watched him carefully now. Then why let people believe something that isn't true? She asked. Elliot didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't easy. Because sometimes, he said finally, it's easier than explaining something people won't understand. Naomi frowned slightly. That doesn't sound like you. It's not, he said, but it's where I am. She studied him, not judging, just seeing. You're avoiding something, she said quietly. Elliot didn't deny it. Yes. Why? He paused, longer this time, because this wasn't a question he could answer without opening something deeper. Because explaining it means admitting something I didn't understand before. Naomi felt that, not the words, but the honesty behind them. And you're not ready to do that? She asked. Elliot met her gaze again. I'm learning how. That word again. Learning. Naomi's expression softened slightly, because she recognized the effort in that, even if it wasn't complete, even if it wasn't clear yet. What is the house, Elliot? She asked gently. Not demanding, not accusing, just asking. Elliot looked at her, and for a moment, he considered telling her everything. Not partially, not carefully, but honestly. But honesty requires timing, and timing requires readiness. I can't explain it yet, he said quietly. Naomi held his gaze, not disappointed, but not satisfied either. That's not the same as it not meaning something, she said. It means everything, he replied. The certainty in his voice changed something, not dramatically, but enough to feel. Naomi nodded slowly. Then, one day, you'll have to say it out loud. Elliot didn't disagree. I know. Another pause. But this one felt different, less uncertain, more inevitable. Naomi stepped back slightly. I should go, she said. Elliot nodded. You always say that before you leave. She gave a small, knowing smile. And you always let me. That's because I think you'll come back. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer. Not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging. Maybe, she said softly. Then she turned and walked away. But this time, her steps weren't as uncertain. Because even though she didn't have answers, she had something else. Clarity, not about him, not about the past, but about one simple truth. The story people were telling was incomplete. And incomplete stories always reveal themselves eventually, not through rumors, not through assumptions, but through truth. And truth has a way of speaking, even when people try to delay it. Behind her, Elliot remained still for a moment, watching, thinking, understanding something he hadn't fully faced before, because for the first time, someone hadn't believed the easier story about him. They had questioned it, and that meant he couldn't hide behind it anymore, not for long, because sooner or later, he would have to explain, not to the world, but to her, and when that moment came, it wouldn't be about what people thought. It would be about what was real, and real things don't stay hidden forever. The woman they called his mistress did not look like a secret. That was the first thing Naomi noticed. There was nothing hidden about her. No hesitation in the way she walked. No uncertainty in the way she carried herself. No quiet guilt that people often associate with something that isn't meant to be seen. If anything, she looked grounded, and that alone was enough to unsettle the story Naomi had been hearing. Naomi saw her by accident. At least, that's what she told herself. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the city softened just slightly, when people moved with less urgency, when conversations lingered a little longer. She had stepped into a small cafe near her office, more out of habit than intention, and that's when she noticed them. Not together. That was what stood out. The woman sat alone by the window, a notebook open in front of her, her attention focused, not on the room, not on her surroundings, but on what she was writing. There was something calm about her, something steady, not performative, not distracting, just present. Naomi slowed slightly, her instincts sharpening, because if this was the woman everyone was talking about, then the story didn't make sense. Mistresses, in the way people imagined them, carried a certain energy. This woman didn't. She didn't look like someone involved in something hidden. She looked like someone certain, and certainty rarely belongs to secrecy. Naomi ordered her coffee, but her attention didn't leave the woman, not out of judgment, but curiosity, careful, quiet curiosity, because something about this felt important. Not in a dramatic way, but in a way that would eventually matter. She sat down a few tables away, her gaze drifting occasionally, not enough to be obvious, but enough to observe. The woman turned a page slowly, her pen moving with intention. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't checking her phone. She was simply there, fully, and Naomi felt something shift, because presence, that kind of presence, was rare, and it reminded her of something she had once needed. A few minutes passed before the woman finally looked up. Their eyes met briefly, and instead of looking away immediately, the woman smiled. Not cautiously, not suspiciously, just kindly. Naomi returned the smile. Small but genuine. And something in that exchange felt unexpectedly easy, not forced, not complicated, just human. The woman closed her notebook gently, taking a sip of her coffee before speaking. You've been observing me, she said. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't defensive. It was simply aware. Naomi blinked once, surprised by the directness, but not offended. I didn't realize I was being obvious, she admitted. The woman smiled slightly. You weren't. I just noticed things. Naomi nodded slowly. I do too. A brief silence followed, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt open, the kind of silence that invites honesty instead of avoiding it. You don't look like someone who enjoys assumptions, the woman added. Naomi let out a quiet breath. I don't. Then why are you here? She asked gently. The question wasn't intrusive. It was precise. Naomi considered her answer carefully. Because this moment, this conversation, didn't feel random. I think I'm trying to understand something, she said. The woman tilted her head slightly. About me? Naomi hesitated. Then, about someone connected to you. There it was. Not direct, but not hidden either. The woman didn't react with surprise. If anything, she seemed to expect it. Elliot, she said. Naomi's eyes lifted. Yes. The woman nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. That makes sense. Naomi studied her more closely now, not just observing, but listening. You know what people are saying, Naomi said. It wasn't a question. The woman gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. People usually say more than they understand. That's true, Naomi replied. Another pause. But this one carried something deeper, because now, they weren't just talking. They were standing at the edge of something important. Naomi leaned slightly forward, her voice quieter now. Are you what they think you are? The question could have sounded harsh, accusing, but it didn't, because Naomi didn't ask it with judgment. She asked it with honesty. And the woman recognized that. No, she said simply. No explanation, no defense, just truth. Naomi felt something settle, not relief, but clarity. Then why does it look that way? She asked. The woman exhaled softly, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning. Because he hasn't explained it, she said. And you haven't corrected it? The woman shook her head gently. It's not my story to explain. That answer lingered, because it carried something Naomi understood too well. Sometimes, silence isn't avoidance. It's respect. Naomi studied her for a moment longer. You don't seem like someone who would stay in something unclear, she said. The woman smiled slightly. I'm not. Then why are you here? The woman paused. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer mattered. I'm here because what he's trying to do is difficult, she said. Naomi's brows drew together slightly. What do you mean? The woman looked at her directly now. He's trying to understand something he didn't understand before, she said. Naomi felt that immediately, because she knew exactly what that meant. And you're helping him? She asked. The woman considered that. Then, no, she said softly. I'm not helping him. Naomi frowned slightly. Then what are you doing? The woman's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with clarity. I'm part of what he needs to understand. That answer didn't confuse Naomi. It deepened the question. Because now, this wasn't about a relationship. This was about something else entirely. Something unfinished. Naomi sat back slightly, her thoughts shifting, reorganizing, re-evaluating. Because everything she had heard, everything people believed, didn't match what she was seeing. You don't love him, Naomi said quietly. It wasn't a challenge. It was an observation. The woman smiled, but this time there was something more thoughtful in it. Not the way you think, she said. Naomi held her gaze. And the way I think is... The woman tilted her head slightly. The way people assume, she said. Possessive, romantic, defined. Naomi felt a quiet understanding settle in. Then what is it? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, what was he to you? The question caught Naomi off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was precise. He was... Naomi paused, her voice softening. Someone I loved. The woman nodded. And someone you understood? Naomi hesitated. Then, not completely, she admitted. The woman's expression didn't change. But something in her eyes did. That's what this is about, she said. Naomi felt it. Before she fully processed it, she felt it. This isn't about you and him, the woman continued gently. It's about who he was, and who he's trying to become. Naomi's breath slowed, because that was the truth she had been circling without fully naming. And the house? Naomi asked quietly. The woman's gaze softened slightly. That's part of it, she said. Part of what? The woman held her gaze. Of him learning what he should have understood the first time. The words landed gently, but deeply, because Naomi knew exactly what that meant. Even if she didn't know the details yet, a silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It was revealing, because now, Naomi understood something clearly. This woman was not the problem. She was not the reason. She was not the interruption. She was part of the truth, and truth rarely looks the way people expect. Naomi stood slowly, her thoughts settling into something calmer now. Thank you, she said. The woman nodded. For what? For not letting me believe the easier version of this, Naomi replied. The woman gave a small, knowing smile. The easier version is almost never the real one. Naomi smiled faintly. I've learned that. She hesitated for just a moment. Then, what's your name? The woman looked at her, not guarded, not distant, just open. Clara, she said. Naomi nodded once. I'm Naomi. I know, Clara replied gently. That surprised her, but not entirely, because something about this, all of this, felt connected in ways she hadn't fully understood yet. Naomi gave a final small smile, then turned and walked toward the door. But this time, her steps felt different, not uncertain, not conflicted, but clearer, because the story she had been hearing wasn't the truth. And the truth was starting to reveal itself, not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet, deliberate pieces, the way real understanding always does. Behind her, Clara watched her leave, her expression thoughtful, not concerned, not worried, just aware, because she knew something Naomi was only beginning to understand. This wasn't about replacing anyone. It wasn't about moving on. It wasn't about a new beginning. It was about something far more difficult, facing what had been left unfinished. And Elliot was finally standing at the center of it. Whether he was ready or not, Elliot didn't expect her to come to him that night. And yet, when he opened the door and saw Naomi standing there, he didn't look surprised. He looked ready, not prepared, not composed, but ready in the way someone is when they know something unavoidable has finally arrived. Naomi didn't step in immediately. She stood at the doorway, her posture calm, her expression steady, but her eyes carried something deeper. Not anger, not confusion, clarity, and that was far more difficult to face. "Can I come in?" she asked. Elliot stepped aside without hesitation. "You don't have to ask." She walked past him slowly, her gaze moving through the space, not searching, not judging, just taking it in. The apartment was exactly how she expected it to be. Clean, structured, controlled, everything in its place. Everything. Except the one thing that had always been missing. He closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet room. Neither of them spoke immediately, because this wasn't a conversation you rushed into. This was the kind you arrived at. Naomi turned to face him. "I met her." Elliot's breath shifted, subtly but noticeably, not because he was shocked, but because the moment he had been delaying had found him anyway. "Clara," he said. Naomi nodded. "She doesn't look like what people say she is." Elliot let out a quiet breath. "She isn't." Naomi studied him carefully. "I know." That answer landed differently, because it removed the distance. It removed the misunderstanding. It removed the easy explanation he could have hidden behind. Now, there was only truth left. Naomi took a few steps further into the room, her voice softer, but more precise. "So what is she?" Elliot didn't respond immediately. He walked past her slightly, not to avoid her, but to think, to find the words that didn't come easily to him. "They think she's my mistress," he said quietly. Naomi didn't interrupt. "They think I bought her a house," he continued. "And you didn't?" Naomi asked. Elliot turned to face her. "I did." That honesty didn't shock her. It confirmed something. "But not for the reason they believe," he added. Naomi nodded slowly. "I know that too." A small silence followed. But this one didn't carry confusion. It carried expectation. Because now, he had to say it. Not partially, not carefully, but honestly. Naomi stepped closer. "What is the house, Elliot?" Her voice wasn't demanding. It wasn't emotional. It was grounded, and that made it impossible to avoid. Elliot held her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't try to control how this conversation would go. He didn't try to shape it. He didn't try to protect himself from it. He just answered, "It's for you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to, because they landed exactly where they were meant to. Naomi didn't react immediately, not because she didn't hear him, but because she needed to understand him. "For me," she repeated. Elliot nodded once. Yes. Silence. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that hadn't been said before. Naomi's voice lowered slightly. "Why?" Elliot looked at her, not guarded, not distant, just open. "Because I didn't understand what I lost," he said. Naomi felt that deeply. "But you left," she said quietly. Elliot shook his head. "No," he corrected gently. "You left." She held his gaze. "And why do you think that happened?" That question stayed between them, not as a challenge, but as a truth waiting to be acknowledged. Elliot didn't look away. "Because I wasn't there," he said. Naomi's breath slowed, because hearing him say it, not vaguely, not defensively, but clearly, changed something. "And the house fixes that?" she asked. Elliot's expression softened slightly. "No." The honesty in that answer mattered more than anything else he could have said. "Then what does it do?" she asked. Elliot took a small step closer. "It gives me a chance to do it differently," he said. Naomi studied him, not emotionally, not reactively, but thoughtfully. "You think a place changes how people love?" she asked. "No," Elliot said, "but it can reflect how they choose to." Naomi exhaled softly, because that answer was closer to understanding than anything he had said before. "And what are you choosing now?" she asked. Elliot didn't hesitate this time. "To be present." The words were simple, but the weight behind them wasn't. Naomi looked away briefly, her thoughts shifting, reorganizing, because this wasn't about the house. It wasn't about Clara. It wasn't about the rumors. It was about something much more difficult. Change. Real change. The kind that doesn't happen in words. The kind that reveals itself in consistency, in effort, in time. She turned back to him. And why now? She asked. Elliot paused. Because this question, this one, mattered the most. Because I finally understood what you were asking for, he said. Naomi's eyes held his. And what was that? Elliot's voice softened. You weren't asking for more from me, he said. You were asking for me. That landed, not dramatically, but deeply, because it was true. And truth doesn't need volume to be felt. Naomi's expression shifted, not into softness, not into resistance, but into something more grounded. Understanding. That took you a long time to realize, she said quietly. Elliot nodded. Yes. And what makes you think I'm still waiting for that? She asked. There it was. The question he couldn't answer with certainty. The part that required humility. I don't, he said. Naomi felt that answer. Because it didn't assume, it didn't expect, it didn't demand. It simply acknowledged. Then what are you doing? She asked. Elliot looked at her, not as someone he needed to convince, but as someone he needed to be honest with. I'm not trying to get you back, he said. Naomi's brows softened slightly. I'm trying to become someone who understands what I had. The room fell quiet, but not heavy, not tense, just real. Naomi walked slowly toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. So the house, she said softly, isn't about starting over. Elliot stepped closer, but not too close. No, he said, it's about not repeating the same mistake. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, because that was the difference. Not promises, not gestures, but awareness, and awareness changes everything. She opened her eyes again, her voice steady. You should have understood this before, she said. Elliot didn't argue. I should have, but you didn't. No, and now you do. Yes. A pause, then, and that doesn't undo what happened. Elliot nodded slowly. I know. Naomi turned to face him fully now, and it doesn't guarantee anything. I know that too. Another silence. But this one felt different, because now, they weren't trying to define the future. They were understanding the past, and that was where everything had to begin. Naomi took a small breath. Then, Clara said you're learning. Elliot's expression shifted slightly. She would say that. Naomi studied him. Are you? Elliot didn't hesitate. Yes. She nodded once. Not approving, not dismissing, just acknowledging. Learning takes time, she said. I know. And effort. I know. And consistency. Elliot held her gaze. I know. Naomi exhaled softly, because knowing was the beginning, not the proof. She stepped back slightly. I'm not the same person I was, she said. Elliot nodded. I don't expect you to be, and I don't know if I can go back to something that once made me feel alone. You shouldn't, he said. That answer surprised her, but it mattered, because it meant he understood something essential. Love wasn't about returning to what was. It was about deciding what could be. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and for the first time, she saw something different. Not perfection, not certainty, but effort, real effort. And that was new. She moved toward the door slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just choosing. I'm not ready to decide anything, she said. Elliot nodded. I'm not asking you to. She paused at the door, then looked back at him. But I see you trying, she added quietly. Elliot didn't respond immediately, because that was more than he expected. And that matters, she finished. A small silence followed. Then Naomi opened the door and walked out, not closing anything, not starting anything, just leaving space, the kind of space that allows something real to grow, or not. And inside the apartment, Elliot remained still, not relieved, not certain, but aware, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to win her back. He was trying to understand what it meant to love her the right way, and that was where everything truly began. The next conversation didn't happen immediately, and that mattered, because for the first time in their story, neither Elliot nor Naomi rushed what they were feeling. They let it sit, they let it breathe, they let it become something clearer, without forcing it into something familiar. A few days passed, not filled with dramatic moments or constant communication, just quiet awareness, the kind that lingers beneath everything else you do. Elliot didn't call her, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood something he hadn't before. Presence wasn't about showing up whenever you felt like it. It was about respecting the space someone needed. And Naomi, she noticed that more than she expected to, because in the past, Elliot would have tried to fix things quickly. He would have reached out, explained more, reassured her, tried to move forward. But this time, he didn't, and somehow, That felt different. Not distant, not careless, just intentional. When they saw each other again, it was Naomi who initiated it. A simple message. "Are you free this evening?" Elliot read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. And this time, he didn't respond immediately. Not out of hesitation, but out of thought. Then, yes. They met somewhere neutral, a quiet park, just as the evening light began to soften. No distractions, no expectations, just space. Naomi was already there when Elliot arrived, sitting on a bench, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful. She didn't stand when she saw him, and he didn't expect her to. Instead, he walked over and sat beside her, not too close, not distant, just beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because silence, when it's shared willingly, doesn't need to be filled. "It feels different," Naomi said finally. Elliot glanced at her slightly. "What does?" "This," she said. He nodded, slowly. "It does." Another pause, but this one felt easier, less weighted by the past, more open to the present. Naomi looked ahead, her voice calm. "You didn't try to convince me," she said. Elliot didn't look away from the path in front of them. "I realized I couldn't." That answer was simple, but it carried something new. Humility. Naomi turned slightly toward him. "You used to try," she said. "I know. You used to explain things in a way that made sense to you, but not always to me." Elliot exhaled softly. "I thought understanding was about being right," he admitted. Naomi's lips pressed together slightly. "And now? Now I think it's about listening long enough to realize you might not be." That made her pause, because that was something he hadn't done before. Not fully. She studied him for a moment. "You've changed," she said. Elliot didn't respond immediately, because that word, change, was complicated. "I'm trying to," he said. Naomi nodded slowly. "I can see that." A small silence followed. Then, "But trying and being are not the same thing." Elliot met her gaze. "I know." And that mattered more than anything else. Because before, he would have defended himself, explained, justified. Now, he simply acknowledged. Naomi looked away again, her thoughts moving carefully. "I don't want to go back to what we had," she said. Elliot didn't flinch. "Neither do I." She glanced at him, surprised. "You don't?" He shook his head. "No." That answer shifted something, because it wasn't what she expected. "Why?" she asked. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely together. "Because what we had wasn't enough for you," he said. Naomi's breath slowed. "And it wasn't complete for me either," he added. That part surprised her more. "You didn't feel that?" she asked. Elliot gave a small, almost reflective nod. "I just didn't understand it at the time." Naomi looked at him more carefully now. "Because this was new." "You're saying you were unhappy?" she asked. Elliot shook his head slightly. "No, I was comfortable." Naomi frowned slightly. "And that's different?" "Yes," he said. "Comfort doesn't require growth." That sentence lingered, because it was true, and truth has a way of settling into places you didn't expect. Naomi leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "I stayed longer than I should have," she admitted quietly. Elliot didn't interrupt, because he knew. This part wasn't about him speaking, it was about him listening. "I kept thinking it would change," she continued. "That you would notice, without me having to say it again." Elliot's voice, when he spoke, was softer. "I wish I had." Naomi nodded. "I know. Not bitter, not resentful, just aware. And I don't blame you the way I used to," she added. Elliot's gaze shifted slightly. "You don't?" She shook her head. "No." A small pause. "Because I understand something now too." Elliot waited. "Loving someone doesn't mean they automatically know how to love you the right way," she said. That landed deeply, because it removed blame, and replaced it with responsibility. On both sides. Elliot looked at her more fully now. "What do you think love is now?" he asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. Not quickly, not emotionally, but honestly. "I think it's awareness," she said. Elliot's brows softened slightly. "Awareness?" She nodded. "Of yourself, of the other person, of what you're doing and what you're not doing." Elliot absorbed that. "And what happens when you don't have that awareness?" he asked. Naomi gave a small, almost sad smile. "You end up loving someone, in a way that slowly hurts them." Silence followed. But this one was different, because it didn't carry tension. It carried understanding, shared, mutual, earned. Elliot exhaled slowly. "I don't want to do that again," he said. Naomi looked at him. "And what makes you think you won't?" He didn't rush the answer, because this question deserved more than intention. "It's not about what I think," he said. "It's about what I choose, consistently." Naomi studied him, Because that was the right answer. Not confident, not absolute, but real. And if you fail, she asked. Elliot met her gaze. Then I'll recognize it sooner. Naomi felt that, because that was the difference. Not perfection, but awareness. The sun dipped lower, the light around them softening further. Time had passed, but neither of them seemed aware of how much. Naomi crossed her arms lightly, her tone quieter now. This isn't easy, she said. Elliot nodded. I know, and it shouldn't be, she added. He glanced at her slightly. Why not? Because easy things don't force you to grow, she said. Elliot gave a small, thoughtful nod. That's true. Another pause. But this one felt steady, like something was settling into place. Not finished, not defined, but grounded. Naomi stood slowly, not abruptly, just naturally. Elliot looked up at her, but didn't stand immediately. You're leaving? He asked. She nodded. For now, that word mattered, because it didn't close anything. It left space. Elliot stood then, facing her, not blocking her path, not holding her back, just present. Naomi looked at him for a moment, long enough to feel it, long enough to recognize it. You're different, she said again. Elliot didn't respond, because he knew. It wasn't something he needed to claim. It was something she needed to see. And she was starting to, but I need to see if it stays, she added. Elliot nodded. You should. That answer was quiet, but it carried something important. Respect. For her process, for her pace, for her truth. Naomi gave a small nod, then turned and began to walk away. But this time, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like space. The kind that allows something real to either grow or reveal itself for what it truly is. And behind her, Elliot didn't follow. He didn't call out. He didn't interrupt the moment. He just stood there, understanding something he hadn't before. Love wasn't about holding on. It was about showing up in a way that made someone want to stay. And that was something he was only just beginning to learn. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. If this chapter made you think differently about love, about communication, about the quiet ways people drift apart, then take a moment to like this video. Because stories like this aren't just about romance. They're about understanding what we often realize too late. And I want to hear from you. Do you believe love is enough on its own? Or does it only work when both people learn how to show up the right way? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective might help someone else see their own story more clearly. And if you're enjoying this journey with Naomi and Elliot, don't forget to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because what happens next isn't about going back. It's about whether two people can truly rebuild something better than what they lost. Stay with me. The truth behind the house is finally about to be revealed. The house wasn't what Naomi expected. That was the first thing she realized the moment Elliot stopped the car and turned off the engine. She didn't speak right away. She just looked. Because whatever she had imagined, something grand, something excessive, something that fit the version of him people talked about, this wasn't it. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It didn't try to impress. It stood quietly at the edge of a tree-lined street, surrounded by stillness instead of attention. The kind of place that didn't need to be seen to feel valuable. Naomi's eyes moved slowly across it, taking in the details, the simplicity, the intention. This is it? She asked softly. Elliot nodded. This is it. She didn't get out of the car immediately, not because she was hesitant, but because she was trying to understand, because this didn't look like a mistake, and it definitely didn't look like a rumor. It looked like something chosen, carefully, thoughtfully, which made it harder to dismiss. Naomi opened the door slowly and stepped out, the quiet of the space settling around her almost instantly. It felt different here, not distant from the city, but separate from it. Like time moved at a different pace. Elliot walked around the car, stopping a few steps behind her, not beside her, not ahead of her, just giving her space to feel it first. Naomi moved toward the house slowly, her steps unhurried. You didn't bring me here to impress me, she said. It wasn't a question. Elliot shook his head slightly. No. She glanced back at him briefly. Then why does it feel like you're trying to say something? Elliot didn't answer immediately. Because the truth, the real truth, couldn't be rushed. It's not about saying something, he said finally. It's about showing you something. Naomi turned back toward the house, and for the first time, she felt it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to notice. This place wasn't built for attention. It was built for presence. Inside, the house felt even quieter, not empty, not unfinished, just intentional. Every space had room to breathe. Every detail felt considered, but not overdone. Naomi walked slowly through the living area, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair. You designed this? She asked. Elliot leaned slightly against the wall, watching her, not the house. Yes. She paused, her gaze shifting toward the windows. There was something familiar in the way the light filled the room, something she couldn't immediately place, but felt. This doesn't feel like you, she said. Elliot nodded. It's not the version of me you knew. Naomi turned to face him. Then, who is it? Elliot met her gaze. It's who I'm trying to become. That answer settled into the room, quietly, but deeply. Naomi walked further in, her attention moving through each space. The kitchen, simple, open, inviting. The hallway, not narrow, not confined, just easy. And then, she stopped, her breath catching slightly, because, at the end of the hallway, was a room she hadn't expected, not because of what it was, but because of how it felt. She stepped inside slowly, and for a moment, she didn't speak. The room wasn't extravagant. It wasn't overly designed, but it was thoughtful. There was a large window that let in soft, natural light. A chair placed near it, not for decoration, but for use. A shelf, not filled, but ready. And something about it, something subtle, made her chest tighten. Elliot didn't move. He didn't explain. He just let her feel it, because this part wasn't something he could define for her. Naomi turned slowly, her voice quieter now. This room. She hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was starting to understand. You remembered, she said. Elliot's expression softened. Yes. Naomi looked around again, her eyes slower now, more intentional, because this wasn't random. This wasn't guesswork. This was memory. Careful, precise, real. This is how I used to describe what I wanted, she said softly. Elliot nodded. I know. She let out a slow breath. I didn't think you were listening back then. Elliot looked at her. I wasn't listening the way I should have. That honesty, it didn't fix anything, but it mattered, because it acknowledged something real. Naomi stepped closer to the window, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to say I wanted a space that felt calm, not perfect. Elliot nodded. I remember. I wanted somewhere that felt lived in, not just designed. I remember that too. She turned slightly, her eyes searching his. So you built this now? Elliot didn't hesitate. Yes. Why now? There it was. The question that mattered more than anything else. Elliot took a small step forward, not too close, but closer than before. Because I finally understood what you meant, he said. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. And what did I mean? Elliot's voice softened. You weren't asking for a place, he said. You were asking for a feeling. That landed deep, because it was true, and it had always been true. Naomi's eyes dropped briefly, her thoughts moving through something she hadn't expected to feel. Not pain, not regret, but recognition. You didn't understand that before, she said quietly. Elliot shook his head. No. And now you do. Yes. A pause. And that's why you built this. Elliot held her gaze. Yes. The room fell into silence again. But this time, it wasn't uncertain. It was full, because now, the house wasn't just a place. It was a reflection of effort, of awareness, of something Elliot had taken too long to learn, but had finally started to understand. Naomi walked slowly back toward the center of the room, her voice calm, measured, honest. This isn't about me coming back, is it? She asked. Elliot didn't hesitate. No. That answer mattered more than anything else, because it removed expectation. It removed pressure. It removed the idea that this was something she owed him. Then, what is it? She asked. Elliot looked around the room briefly. Then, back at her. It's about me not repeating the same mistake. If I ever get another chance, he said. Naomi felt that, because it wasn't directed at her, not completely, it was directed at him, at his growth, at his understanding, at his willingness to do something differently, whether or not she was part of it. And that was new. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. This must have taken time, she said. It did. And thought. Yes. And attention. Elliot nodded. Yes. She looked at him again, and, for the first time, there was no question in her eyes, just clarity. You're trying to become someone who knows how to love better, she said. Elliot didn't respond immediately, because that was the simplest way to say it. Yes, he said finally. Naomi nodded slowly, not approving, not rejecting, just understanding. She walked toward the door of the room, pausing for a moment before stepping out. This is different, she said. Elliot followed at a distance. I know, and it matters, she added. Elliot's breath shifted slightly. Because that was more than he expected. But it doesn't erase anything, she continued. I know. And it doesn't mean I can just step back into something that once hurt me. I know. Each answer came without hesitation, without defense, without resistance. And that was what made it real. Naomi turned to face him one last time before moving toward the exit. But it shows me something, she said. Elliot waited. That you finally understand what I was asking for, she finished. A small silence followed. Then, and that matters more than anything you could have built before. Elliot didn't speak, because he knew. This wasn't about him explaining anything else. It was about her seeing something for herself. And she had. Naomi stepped outside, the quiet of the place settling around her again. But this time, it didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt understood. She turned back once more, not to question, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge. This isn't the end of something, she said softly. Elliot looked at her. No, it's the beginning of understanding. He nodded. Yes. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, then turned and walked away. Not uncertain, not conflicted, just aware. And inside the house, Elliot stood still, not expecting anything, not assuming anything, just present, because, for the first time, he wasn't building something to prove love. He was building something that reflected it. And that was where everything had truly changed. Naomi didn't go home immediately after leaving the house. She drove for a while, not lost, not searching, just thinking, because what she had seen didn't leave her the way she expected it to. It didn't create excitement. It didn't create certainty. It created something far more difficult to sit with, understanding. And understanding has a quiet way of complicating everything. She pulled over eventually, the engine idling softly as her hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. Her eyes drifted forward, unfocused, because her mind wasn't on the road anymore. It was on him, on what he had done, on what it meant, and more importantly, on what it didn't mean. Naomi let out a slow breath. He understands now. The words left her quietly, almost like she needed to hear them out loud to believe them. And that was what made this so hard, because the version of Elliot she had once needed was starting to exist, just not when she needed him. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes, not to escape the thought, but to feel it fully, because avoiding it would only delay what she already knew. This wasn't about whether he had changed. He had. She could see it. She could feel it. She could hear it in the way he spoke, the way he paused, the way he didn't try to control the moment anymore. No. The real question wasn't about him. It was about her, and that question was harder to answer. Naomi opened her eyes slowly, her voice quieter now. Am I ready to trust that? There it was. The truth she had been circling. Because change, no matter how real it looks, always comes with risk. And Naomi had learned what it felt like to give someone the benefit of the doubt, only to slowly lose herself in the process. She wasn't that woman anymore. She couldn't be, not because she didn't believe in love, but because she finally understood herself. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. She glanced down. A message from Elliot. Not long, not overwhelming. Just, thank you for coming. Naomi stared at it for a moment, because even that, even something that simple, was different. No pressure, no follow-up, no attempt to extend the moment, just acknowledgement. And space. She picked up the phone, her thumb hovering briefly before typing. I'm glad I did. She paused, then added, it helped me understand. She didn't say what. She didn't explain, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to. She hit send and set the phone down again. Minutes passed. Then her phone buzzed once more. She glanced at it. That's all I hoped for. Naomi read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. And simplicity, when it's genuine, carries a kind of weight that's hard to ignore. She exhaled slowly, placing the phone back down, because now there was nothing else to say, and that was okay. Later that night, Naomi sat by her window again, the same place she had sat so many times before, but something felt different, not externally, not visibly, but internally, quieter, clearer, more grounded. She wrapped her arms lightly around herself, her gaze drifting over the city lights. I don't miss him the way I used to, she admitted softly. And that was true. The longing, the ache, the constant replay of what had been, that had faded. But what remained was something more complicated, because she didn't miss who he was. She was starting to recognize who he was becoming. And that version of him was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. Naomi leaned her head slightly against the glass. You're different now, she whispered. Not to him, not directly, but to the version of him she had seen earlier that day, and that matters. A pause. But it doesn't erase what I felt. That mattered too, because growth doesn't erase pain. It just changes how you carry it. She closed her eyes briefly, and for the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding, not out of fear, but out of honesty. If he had been this way before, would I have stayed? The answer came quietly, without hesitation. Yes. Her chest tightened slightly, because that answer didn't hurt the way it once would have. It clarified something. It confirmed something. It reminded her that what she had needed had been real, valid, reasonable, and not too much. Naomi opened her eyes again, and this time, she didn't look at the city. She looked at her reflection, at herself, at who she had become, and she realized something important. I didn't leave because I was weak, she said softly. I left because I finally understood what I deserved. That truth settled deeply, because it removed doubt. It removed guilt. It removed the quiet question that had followed her for so long. Was I asking for too much? No, she hadn't been. Her phone buzzed again. She frowned slightly, glancing down. Another message. From Elliot. She hesitated before opening it. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be intentional. Then, she read it. I'm not expecting anything from you. She paused. Then the next line. But I meant what I said. I'm learning. Naomi stared at the screen for a long moment. Because those words, they weren't meant to convince her. They weren't meant to pull her closer. They were just true, and truth, when it isn't forced, feels different. She placed the phone down again, not responding immediately, not reacting, just sitting with it. Because this wasn't about quick decisions. This wasn't about emotional reactions. This was about something slower, something more deliberate, something that required time. Naomi stood, walking slowly toward the center of the room, her voice quiet, but steady. I don't know what this becomes. She let the words sit. I don't know if it becomes anything at all. Another pause. But I know this. She looked out the window again, not searching, not questioning, just aware. This time, I won't ignore what I feel. That was the difference. That was the growth. That was what everything had been leading to. Not a reunion, not a decision, but awareness of herself, of him, of what love actually required. She picked up her phone again, not out of urgency, but intention, and this time, she typed slowly, carefully. Honestly, I see that you're trying. She paused, then added, that matters to me. She read it once, then sent it, and as the message delivered, Naomi didn't feel relief. She didn't feel certainty, but she felt something else, something quieter, something steadier, something real, clarity, not about what would happen next, but about how she would move forward. And sometimes, that's where everything truly begins, not with answers, but with understanding, the kind that allows you to choose, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of truth. Naomi didn't plan the conversation. That was the only way it could happen, honestly, because anything rehearsed would have sounded like something she had already said before, and this time she wasn't interested in repeating herself. She wanted to say what she had never fully said, not because Elliot hadn't heard her in the past, but because she hadn't always been clear enough with herself. It was late evening when she knocked on his door again. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just certainty. Elliot opened the door almost immediately, as if part of him had expected her, even without knowing when. Their eyes met, and this time there was no distance, only awareness. Can I come in? She asked. He stepped aside. Always. Naomi walked in slowly, but unlike before, she didn't look around. She didn't observe the space. She didn't take her time, because this time, she wasn't here to understand him. She was here to be understood. She turned to face him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this wasn't a conversation you entered casually. It was one you stepped into carefully. I need to say something, Naomi began. Elliot nodded once. I'm listening. And this time, she believed him. That alone changed everything. Naomi took a small breath, her voice steady but deeper than before. When I was with you, I didn't feel lonely because you weren't there. Elliot didn't interrupt. I felt lonely because I didn't feel chosen, she continued. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that didn't need explanation. Elliot's jaw tightened slightly, not defensively, but with recognition. Naomi stepped closer. Do you understand the difference? She asked. Elliot nodded slowly. Yes. But she shook her head gently. No. I need you to say it. That stopped him, not because he didn't know, but because saying it required him to fully face it. Elliot exhaled slowly. You felt like I was there out of habit. Not intention, he said, Naomi held his gaze. And, Elliot swallowed slightly, and you needed to feel like I was choosing you. Not just including you. The silence that followed was heavy. Not tense, but real. Naomi nodded once. That's what I was asking for, she said. She turned slightly, pacing a few steps, not out of anxiety but to keep her thoughts moving. I didn't need more time, she continued. I needed present time. Elliot's eyes didn't leave her. I didn't need more things. I needed to feel like I mattered, in the moments that didn't require effort. She stopped, then looked at him again, and I kept trying to explain that, but I don't think I fully understood it myself back then. Elliot's voice was quiet. But you do now. Naomi nodded. Yes. She stepped closer again, her tone soft, but firm. And now, I need you to understand something else. Elliot didn't move. I'm not afraid that you'll go back to who you were, she said. That surprised him. You're not? He asked. She shook her head. No. A pause. I'm afraid that I might forget what it felt like, and accept less again. That landed harder than anything she had said before. Because this wasn't about blaming him. This was about protecting herself. And Elliot understood that immediately. You won't, he said. Naomi's eyes didn't soften. You don't know that. He didn't argue. Because she was right. I don't, he admitted. Another silence. But this one felt like something was being cleared. Like something that had been sitting unspoken for too long was finally being given space to breathe. Naomi exhaled slowly. I've grown, Elliot. I know. And that growth came from walking away from something I loved, because it wasn't right for me anymore. Elliot nodded, his expression steady. I understand that. Naomi studied him. Do you? She asked. He met her gaze. Yes. How? Elliot paused. Then, because I'm trying to become someone who wouldn't make you feel that way again, he said. Naomi held his gaze. And what does that actually look like? That question, that was the one that mattered. Not intentions, not awareness, but action. Elliot didn't rush the answer, because this wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about saying something real. It looks like paying attention. Even when nothing is wrong, he said. Naomi listened. It looks like choosing to be present, even when I'm distracted. She didn't interrupt. It looks like noticing you, without you having to ask me to. A pause. And it looks like understanding that love isn't proven in big moments, but in consistent ones. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt aligned, because, for the first time, they were speaking the same language. Naomi nodded slowly. That's what I needed, she said. Elliot's voice softened. I know. Another pause. Then. And I didn't give it to you. Naomi didn't rush to comfort him, because this wasn't a moment for reassurance. It was a moment for truth. No, you didn't, she said gently. Elliot looked down briefly, then back at her. I can't change that, he said. Naomi nodded. I know, but I can change how I show up now. She studied him carefully. And that matters, she said. Elliot's breath shifted slightly, because hearing that, from her, meant something. But it's not enough on its own, she added. He nodded. I know. Naomi stepped back slightly, creating just enough space to see him clearly. This isn't about whether you've changed, she said. It's about whether that change stays. When it's no longer new. Elliot held her gaze. It will. Naomi didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't something she could accept through words. Only time could prove that. She walked toward the window, her voice quieter now. I don't want to rebuild something based on hope, she said. Elliot didn't interrupt. I want to see something real. Before I decide anything. He nodded. You should. That answer came easily, naturally, because now, he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about convincing her. It was about becoming someone she could trust again. Without asking her to take that risk too soon, Naomi turned back to him. And I'm not promising anything, she added. Elliot shook his head. I'm not asking you to... Another pause. But this one felt different. Less like distance, more like balance. Naomi took a small breath. Then, I just needed you to hear me. Clearly, she said. Elliot nodded. I did. And understand me. I do. And not try to fix it immediately. Elliot's voice softened. I won't. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was asking for something. She felt like she had already been heard. And that, alone, was something she had never fully experienced with him before. She moved toward the door slowly. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Just choosing. This is the first time I feel like you actually understand what I was trying to say all those years, she said. Elliot didn't speak, because he knew that wasn't something he needed to respond to. It was something he needed to continue proving. Naomi placed her hand on the door, then paused, not turning back immediately, just feeling the moment. And then, "I'm not closing this," she said quietly. Elliot's breath caught slightly. "Okay, but I'm not opening it fully either. I understand." She nodded once, then turned, and this time, when she looked at him, it wasn't with expectation, it wasn't with doubt, it was with something quieter, something steadier, something real, recognition, not of who he had been, but of who he was becoming, and that was enough for now. She opened the door, and walked out, leaving it exactly where it needed to be. Not finished, not broken, just in progress. The silence after Naomi left felt different, not empty, not heavy, just honest. Elliot didn't move right away. He stood exactly where she had left him, his eyes resting on the door, not because he expected her to come back, but because something about that moment needed to settle. For years, he had avoided stillness like this, because stillness meant reflection, and reflection meant seeing things clearly. Now, he didn't look away from it. He walked slowly toward the window, the city stretching beneath him again. It looked the same. It always did. But he didn't. And for the first time, that difference felt undeniable. Elliot rested his hands lightly on the edge of the counter, his voice low, almost thoughtful. She didn't leave angry. That realization stayed with him, because anger was easier. Anger gave you something to respond to, something to defend against, something to fix. But Naomi hadn't given him that. She had given him something far more difficult: clarity. And clarity doesn't demand a reaction. It demands understanding. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for just a moment. Her words replayed, not loudly, not chaotically, but with quiet precision. "I didn't feel chosen." That sentence settled deeper than anything else, because it wasn't about what he had done. It was about what he hadn't done. And absence. Absence doesn't leave evidence. It leaves impact. Elliot opened his eyes again, his reflection faint against the glass. For a long time, he had believed love was proven through effort, through building something stable, through making sure nothing could fall apart. But now, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to before. Stability doesn't replace presence, and effort doesn't always translate into connection. He had given Naomi everything he thought she needed, but he hadn't given her the one thing she actually asked for: himself. Elliot leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't choosing her," he said quietly. The words didn't sound harsh. They sounded accurate, because choosing someone isn't a one-time decision. It's a consistent one. It shows up in small moments, in attention, in awareness, in the willingness to pause and be there. And that was where he had failed. Not once, not dramatically, but repeatedly. He walked slowly through the apartment, his steps unhurried. Every space felt familiar. But now, it also felt revealing, because for the first time, he wasn't looking at what he had built. He was looking at what he had missed. And that realization didn't bring regret the way he expected. It brought responsibility. Elliot stopped near the dining table, his fingers brushing lightly against the surface. "I thought love was something you secured," he said. A pause, "but it's something you maintain." That shift, that understanding, changed everything, because it meant love wasn't something you could achieve once and keep. It required attention, consistency, choice, and those were things he had underestimated. He sat down slowly, his posture relaxed, but his thoughts focused. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to solve anything. He wasn't trying to figure out how to fix the situation. He wasn't trying to move forward quickly. He was just sitting with the truth. And the truth didn't rush. It stayed. "She's not asking for promises," he said quietly. That mattered, because promises were easy for him. He knew how to give those. He knew how to say the right things. But Naomi hadn't asked for that. She had asked for something harder: consistency without reassurance, effort without announcement, presence without being reminded. And that required change at a deeper level. Elliot leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together. "I can't prove anything right now." That realization didn't frustrate him. It grounded him, because it meant this wasn't about convincing her. It was about becoming someone who didn't need to. His thoughts drifted briefly to Clara, not as a distraction, but as part of the truth. She hadn't tried to guide him. She hadn't tried to fix him. She had simply reflected something back to him, something he had been avoiding. "You don't need to learn how to love differently," she had told him once. "You need to learn how to be present long enough to understand what love actually requires." At the time, he hadn't fully understood it. Now, he did. Elliot stood again, walking back toward the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, steady and constant. He used to think that was what he needed to create. Something unshakable, something predictable, something secure. But now, he realized something else. Love wasn't about creating something that couldn't change. It was about showing up through the change. He rested his hand lightly against the glass. I can't undo what happened. That truth didn't hurt. It clarified, but I can choose differently now. And that was where everything shifted. Because choice isn't about intention. It's about action. Repeated, consistent, quiet. Elliot stepped back, his expression calmer now. Not resolved, not complete, but grounded. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to rush growth. He wasn't trying to prove change. He was allowing it to happen, slowly, honestly, without performance. He glanced toward the door once more, not expecting her, not waiting for her, just acknowledging the moment, because something had changed tonight. Not between them, not externally, but within him. And that change, that understanding, would determine everything that came next. Not what he said, not what he built, but how he showed up, when it mattered, and more importantly, when it didn't. Elliot let out a quiet breath, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand now. Not everything, not completely, but enough. Enough to begin. And sometimes, that's all real change requires. Not perfection, not certainty, just the willingness to finally see what was always there, and choose differently. From that point forward, the change didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a moment that said, this is different now. It showed up quietly, in small choices, in pauses that didn't exist before, in attention that didn't need to be asked for. Naomi noticed it before she decided what it meant. That was important, because this time, she wasn't looking for proof. She was observing, carefully, honestly, without rushing to conclusions. The first time she saw it clearly, it wasn't during a deep conversation. It wasn't during something emotional. It was something simple, almost easy to overlook. They were sitting across from each other at a quiet cafe, not the same one where they first noticed each other, but something similar, neutral, uncomplicated. Naomi was talking about her day, not about anything serious, just details, small things, the kind of things that used to get lost between them. And Elliot was listening, not occasionally, not partially, fully. There was no phone on the table, no distraction in his eyes, no sense that his attention was divided. He was just there, and Naomi felt it immediately, because this was what she had asked for, not in words, but in feeling. She paused mid-sentence, not intentionally, just instinctively, and Elliot noticed, not after a delay, not after she had to call his name, immediately. What is it? He asked softly. Naomi blinked slightly, caught between surprise and something quieter. You noticed, she said. Elliot frowned slightly. Of course I did. Naomi studied him, because once, that wouldn't have been true. Once, she would have had to repeat herself, or continue talking without knowing if he was really there. But now, he was, and that difference, it mattered. It's nothing, she said gently. Elliot didn't push. He didn't fill the silence. He just waited. And that was new too, because before, he would have tried to move past the pause, fix it, redirect it. Now, he allowed it. And Naomi realized something important. He wasn't just present in conversation. He was present in silence. She let out a small breath. I'm just noticing something, she said. Elliot's expression softened slightly. What? Naomi hesitated, not because she didn't want to say it, but because saying it made it real. You're different when you listen now, she said. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Not because he disagreed, but because he understood what that meant. I'm trying to be, he said quietly. Naomi nodded. I can see that. A small pause followed. Then, and it feels different. Elliot's gaze stayed steady. In a good way? He asked. Naomi considered that carefully. Yes, she said. And that mattered. They didn't turn the moment into something bigger. They didn't analyze it. They didn't rush to define what it meant. They just continued, because this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about allowing something to unfold. Over the next few days, the pattern stayed, not perfectly, but consistently, and Naomi noticed that too. Because consistency doesn't mean perfection. It means intention repeated over time. There were moments where Elliot paused before responding, not to avoid, but to consider. Moments where he asked questions, not to fill space, but to understand. Moments where he simply stayed quiet, without withdrawing. And each of those moments added something, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real. Naomi found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't expected. Not completely, not without awareness, but enough to feel the difference. And that was what mattered most. One evening, They walked together, without a clear destination, no plan, no structure, just movement. And sometimes, the way people move together says more than what they say out loud. Naomi noticed how he adjusted his pace, not obviously, not intentionally, but naturally, not walking ahead, not lagging behind, just beside her. And that small detail, that quiet alignment, said something, because before, Elliot had always been slightly ahead, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, always moving toward the next thing. Now, he stayed where he was, with her. "You're not rushing," she said suddenly. Elliot glanced at her. "I used to," he admitted. Naomi nodded. "I know." A brief silence followed. Then, "What made you stop?" she asked. Elliot took a moment before answering. "Because I realized I was always moving forward, without actually being present where I was," he said. Naomi felt that, and now? Now I'm trying to stay long enough to understand the moment I'm in. Naomi's lips curved slightly. "That sounds simple." "It's not," Elliot said. She nodded. "I can tell." They walked a little further. The city quieter now, less demanding, more open. Naomi glanced at him briefly. "You're not trying to convince me of anything," she said. Elliot shook his head. "No, why not?" He met her gaze. "Because I know I can't," he said. Naomi's expression softened slightly. "And before, I thought if I explained things well enough, you would understand." She nodded slowly. "And now? Now I think understanding comes from what you experience, not what I say." That answer stayed with her, because it was true, and truth, when it's lived, feels different than when it's spoken. They stopped at a quiet corner, the city stretching around them again. Naomi turned slightly toward him. "This doesn't feel like starting over," she said. Elliot nodded. "It's not a pause. It feels like something else." Elliot waited, like we're learning something we didn't understand before. Elliot's voice was softer now. "That's exactly what it is." Naomi looked at him for a moment longer, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and for the first time. She didn't feel like she was waiting for something to go wrong. She felt like she was observing something becoming right, not perfect, not guaranteed, but real. "I'm not ready to trust this completely," she said. Elliot nodded. "I don't expect you to, but I'm not pushing it away either." "That's enough," he said. Naomi exhaled softly. Because that was what made this different. There was no pressure, no urgency, no expectation, just space, and effort, and awareness. She took a step back slightly. "I need time," she said. Elliot nodded. "You should take it. And I need to see this. Stay consistent. It will." Naomi didn't respond to that, not because she doubted him, but because she understood something important. Consistency isn't proven in words. It's proven in time. She gave a small nod, then turned and began to walk away. But this time, there was no heaviness in it, no confusion, no emotional weight pulling her back, just clarity. And behind her, Elliot didn't call out. He didn't interrupt the moment. He just stood there, understanding something he hadn't before. Love isn't about getting someone back. It's about becoming someone they can trust again. And trust isn't built in moments. It's built in patterns. And for the first time, he was focused on the pattern, not the outcome. As Naomi walked, her thoughts felt quieter, not resolved, but grounded. Because now, she wasn't asking if he had changed. She was watching it happen. And sometimes, that's the only answer that matters. The decision didn't arrive as a single moment. It unfolded, quietly, the way most real decisions do, through a series of small recognitions that slowly become impossible to ignore. Naomi didn't wake up one day and suddenly know what she wanted. Instead, she began noticing what she wasn't feeling anymore. She wasn't anxious before seeing him. She wasn't preparing herself for disappointment. She wasn't shrinking her expectations just to keep the peace. And that was new. She stood in front of her mirror one evening, adjusting nothing in particular, just looking at herself, at the woman she had become, not the version of her that stayed too long, not the version that hoped change would happen without evidence, but the version that had learned to walk away, to rebuild, to understand herself without needing someone else to define her worth. And now, she was facing something different, not a decision about him, but a decision about herself. Naomi leaned lightly against the dresser, her voice soft. "I'm not the same person anymore." The words weren't heavy, they were grounding, because they reminded her of something important. Whatever she chose now wouldn't come from the same place it did before, and that meant it wouldn't lead to the same outcome. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A message from Elliot. "I saw something today that reminded me of you." She didn't open it immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because now She was intentional about how she responded to things. She opened the message slowly. It wasn't big, just a small bookstore, but it felt like something you would have liked. Not because of how it looked, but because of how quiet it was. Naomi read it twice, and something in her chest softened. Not because it was romantic, not because it was impressive, but because it was attentive. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was noticing her, and that was what she had always needed. She typed slowly. That sounds like something I would have liked. She paused, then added, "You're paying attention differently now." She hesitated for a moment before sending it, then pressed send. His reply came a few minutes later. "I'm trying to understand you, not just respond to you." Naomi read that carefully, because those words, they weren't perfect, but they were honest. And honesty, when it's consistent, becomes something you can feel. She set her phone down and sat on the edge of her bed. Her thoughts quieter now, less conflicted, more focused, because for the first time, she wasn't asking herself if he had changed. She was asking herself something else. What do I want now? Knowing what I know. And that question, that was the one that mattered most. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the answer come naturally, without forcing it, without shaping it, just allowing it. "I don't want what we had before," she said softly. That was clear, certain, unquestionable. A pause. "But I don't want to walk away from something that might be real either." Her chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from honesty. Because this was where it became difficult. Not because she didn't understand the situation, but because she did. Naomi stood slowly, walking toward the window again, her reflection faint in the glass. "I can see him trying," she said, "and I can feel the difference." Another pause. But feeling it and trusting it are not the same thing. That was the truth she couldn't ignore. Because trust isn't built through understanding. It's built through experience. Repeated, consistent, unforced. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. She glanced at it. "You don't have to decide anything right now." She exhaled slowly, because that was exactly what she needed to hear. Not pressure, not expectation, just space. Naomi typed back, "I know." She paused, then added, "But I also know that not deciding is still a decision." She stared at the message for a second, then sent it. This time, his response took longer, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was choosing his words carefully. When it came, it was simple. "Then take the time to make the right one for you." Naomi read it, and, for the first time, she didn't feel like she was being pulled in any direction. She felt supported, and that was new. She placed her phone down again, and leaned her forehead lightly against the glass. Her thoughts steady now, not rushed, not emotional, just clear. "I don't need him to prove anything anymore," she said quietly. "I need to see it." That shift, that understanding, changed everything, because it meant she wasn't waiting for words. She was watching actions, and actions don't lie. Naomi closed her eyes again, and this time, she allowed herself to imagine something she hadn't before. Not the past, not what they had lost, but what something new could look like. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but honest. And that thought, it didn't scare her, it didn't overwhelm her, it just existed, gently. She opened her eyes again, her voice calm. "I'm not afraid of loving him again." A pause. "I'm afraid of losing myself in it." That was the difference. That was the growth. That was what everything had been leading to. Naomi stepped back from the window, her posture relaxed, her expression steady, because now, she understood something clearly. This wasn't about choosing him, and it wasn't about rejecting him. It was about choosing herself, and then deciding if there was space for him within that choice. Her phone buzzed one last time. She picked it up. A final message from Elliot. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Naomi stared at the words, and this time, she believed them. Not because he said them, but because of everything he had done leading up to them. She set the phone down, gently, and took a slow breath, because now, the decision wasn't urgent. It wasn't forced. It wasn't something she had to figure out immediately. It was something she would arrive at, naturally, honestly, in her own time. Naomi sat back down, her thoughts calm, and for the first time, in a long time, she didn't feel like she was at the edge of something uncertain. She felt like she was standing in the middle of something real, something that didn't need to be rushed, something that didn't need to be perfect, something that just needed to be true. And whatever she chose next, it would come from that place. Not fear, not habit, not longing, but truth. And that was the kind of decision that changes everything. Naomi didn't rush the decision. And because she didn't rush it, it became clear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt steady enough to trust. It happened on a quiet morning. No build-up, no emotional weight pressing on her chest. Just a moment where everything inside her felt aligned. She sat by the window with her coffee, the city slowly waking beneath her, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. She was thinking about what felt right, and the difference between those two thoughts was everything. Naomi wrapped her hands around the cup, her gaze soft but focused. "I don't need to go back," she said quietly. The words didn't carry sadness. They carried clarity, because she wasn't looking for the past anymore. She wasn't trying to fix what had already happened. She wasn't holding on to what they used to be. She had already let that go. And that was why this decision mattered. She stood slowly, walking toward the center of the room. Her reflection caught her attention briefly. Not in a critical way, not in a searching way, just noticing. "I'm not choosing him because I miss him," she continued softly. "I'm choosing what I see now." That was the truth. Simple, grounded, real. Her phone rested on the table behind her. She hadn't touched it yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wanted to be certain that when she did, it would come from clarity, not emotion. And now, it did. Naomi picked up the phone, staring at the screen for a moment. Then she typed, slowly, deliberately, "Can we talk?" She didn't overthink it. She didn't add anything more. She didn't try to control how the conversation would go. She just sent it, and waited. Elliot responded almost immediately. Yes, that was all. No questions, no assumptions, just presence. And even that small response told her something. He wasn't trying to lead the moment. He was allowing it. They met at the house, not because it was symbolic, but because it felt honest. Because that place represented something neither of them had fully understood before. And now, it did. Naomi stepped inside first. This time, the space didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt understood, like she wasn't walking into something new, but something that had finally been seen clearly. Elliot stood in the living area, his posture calm, his expression steady, not anxious, not expectant, just present, and that alone reassured her more than anything he could have said. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because this wasn't a conversation that needed to be rushed. It was one that needed to be felt. Naomi took a small breath. Then, "I made a decision." Elliot nodded once. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Because now, he understood the importance of letting her say it fully. Naomi stepped closer, not hesitantly, not cautiously, just honestly. "I'm not coming back to what we had," she said. Elliot didn't flinch. "I wouldn't want you to," he replied. That answer mattered, because it confirmed something important. They were no longer trying to recreate the past. Naomi held his gaze. "But I'm not walking away either." A small pause, because those words, they carried weight and possibility. Elliot's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his eyes softened. Not relief, not certainty, just understanding. Naomi continued, "I'm choosing to see where this goes," she said. "Not because I believe everything will be perfect." A small breath. "But because I believe we understand something now that we didn't before." Elliot nodded slowly. "Yes." Naomi crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, just grounding herself in the moment. "But this only works if it stays real," she added. Elliot met her gaze. "It will." Naomi didn't respond to that directly, because she didn't need promises. She needed consistency. And both of them knew that. "This isn't about second chances," she said. "It's about doing something differently." Elliot took a small step closer. "I agree." Another pause. Then, "And if at any point it starts to feel like before," Naomi's voice softened slightly, "I'll walk away again." Elliot nodded. "You should." That answer. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't fearful. It was respectful. And that made it real. Naomi exhaled slowly. Because this was what she needed. Not guarantees, not reassurances, just honesty and space. She looked around the house briefly, then back at him. "This place doesn't feel like a promise anymore," she said. Elliot listened. "It feels like a reflection." He nodded. "That's what it is." Naomi stepped a little closer, not closing the distance completely, but not keeping it either. "Then let's not rush this," she said. Elliot's voice was quiet. "We won't." A small silence followed, but this one felt different, not uncertain, not unresolved, just open, because for the first time, they weren't trying to define everything. They were allowing something to exist without pressure. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, not widely, not dramatically, but genuinely. And that That was something he hadn't seen from her in a long time. Not because she hadn't smiled before, but because this one didn't carry hesitation. It carried trust, not complete, not blind, but real. Elliot didn't step forward. He didn't reach for her. He didn't interrupt the space. Because he understood something now. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is not rush the moment. Naomi glanced toward the window, the light filling the room differently now. Softer, warmer, more alive. It's strange, she said quietly. What is? Elliot asked. This doesn't feel like starting over. Elliot nodded. It's not a pause. It feels like we're finally starting correctly. Elliot's voice softened. That's exactly what it is. Naomi looked at him again, and this time, there was no question in her eyes, no hesitation, no confusion, just clarity. And that clarity didn't come from what he had said. It came from what he had shown. Over time, consistently, quietly, she took a small step back, not to create distance, but to hold on to the moment exactly as it was. This is enough for now, she said. Elliot nodded. It is. And as they stood there, not rushing forward, not holding back, just present, something settled between them, not a promise, not a conclusion, but something more honest than both. Understanding, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that doesn't demand certainty, the kind that simply exists. Because both people have finally learned what love actually requires. And this time, they weren't guessing, they weren't assuming, they weren't hoping blindly, they were choosing slowly, carefully, truthfully, not because they were afraid to lose each other again, but because they finally understood. Love isn't something you hold on to. It's something you show up for, every day, in ways that don't need to be announced, only felt, and, for the first time, that was exactly what they were doing. The ending didn't arrive the way stories usually do. There was no dramatic moment, no final declaration that solved everything, no perfect scene that made the future feel guaranteed. Instead, there was something quieter, something more honest, something that felt real. Weeks passed, and nothing extraordinary happened, which, for the first time, meant everything. Because before, their relationship had been defined by what was missing. Now, it was being defined by what was consistently there. Elliot didn't become perfect. He still had moments where he paused too long. Moments where he almost drifted into old habits. Moments where silence lingered just a little too close to distance. But the difference was, he noticed. And more importantly, he corrected it. Not with words, not with promises, but with presence. Naomi saw it. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And that repetition, that consistency, was what slowly rebuilt something she hadn't realized was still fragile. Not love, but trust. One evening they sat together in the house, not discussing anything important, not revisiting the past, just existing in the same space. Naomi had a book in her hand. Elliot sat across from her, reading something of his own. No conversation, no need to fill the silence, just presence. After a while, Naomi looked up, not because something was wrong, but because something felt right. You're here, she said softly. Elliot glanced up, a faint smile touching his expression. I am. Naomi studied him for a moment, not searching, not questioning, just noticing, and then she nodded. Not because she needed confirmation, but because she felt it. That was the moment everything became clear. Not because it changed something, but because it confirmed something. This wasn't about whether they would end up together. It wasn't about whether love had returned. It was about something deeper. They had learned, individually, and together. Naomi closed her book gently, her voice thoughtful. I used to think love was about finding the right person, she said. Elliot listened. Now, he always did. And now? He asked. She looked at him, her expression calm. Now I think it's about becoming the right person, and choosing each other from that place. Elliot nodded slowly. That makes sense. A small pause. Then, I didn't know how to do that before, he admitted. Naomi's lips curved slightly. I didn't know how to ask for it properly either. And that was the truth. Because love isn't just about what one person gives. It's about what both people understand. They didn't rush to define what they were. They didn't label it. They didn't force it into something clear. Because clarity didn't need a name. It showed itself in how they spoke, in how they listened, in how they stayed. And that's where the story finds its ending. Not in certainty, not in perfection, but in understanding. But every story like this leaves one question, not for the characters, but for you. Because love doesn't have just one ending. It has choices, and each choice leads to something different. So here are 3 truths this story could hold, and the one that feels right is the one you carry with you. Ending option A. They choose each other again not because they missed what they had, but because they understood what they could build now, slowly, intentionally, without rushing, without assuming, without repeating the same mistakes. In this version, they stay, not perfectly, but honestly, and that becomes enough. Ending option B. They let each other go, not out of failure, but out of growth. Because sometimes, understanding comes too late to rebuild what was lost, but just in time to let go without regret. In this version, they walk away, not as strangers, but as people who finally saw each other clearly, and that clarity gives them peace. Ending option C. They leave it open, not deciding everything, not forcing an outcome, just continuing, learning, growing, seeing where it leads without needing to define it immediately. In this version, they don't rush the ending, because they understand something important. Real love doesn't need to be proven in a single moment. It reveals itself over time, and maybe that's the real truth this story was trying to tell. Love isn't about finding something perfect. It's about understanding something real and choosing it again and again in ways that matter, because, in the end, it was never about the house, it was never about the rumor, it was never about who left or who stayed. It was about something much simpler and much harder, learning how to love someone the way they actually need, and learning how to love yourself enough to recognize when that matters.